Coming up.
Has there been momentum growing in the defund the CBC
movement? Yeah, people in the
Order,
north.
please.
You said you just disagree with all
Order,
support
please.
to media.
Do you think the CBC respects the Canadian taxpayer?
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
So I begin with, for the Conservatives, Monsieur Kuek, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and appreciate the conversation that we're having today. Ms. Sims and Mr. Thorpe, we heard from the incoming CEO of CBC this past Wednesday that she had not heard any conversations from Canadians about defunding the CBC. I'm wondering if that resonates or lines up with what you and your organization has heard about this subject over the last number of years.
No, through the chair, with respect, that doesn't line up with what we're seeing with our organization. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation has been pushing for the CBC to be defunded. We hear from our supporters every single day, and there are thousands of them that want the CBC to be defunded. So no, that does not line up with what our supporters want.
I found it interesting when I heard that response on Wednesday, and we had Ms. Catherine Tate, who's the current CEO, her term coming to an end in the next month or so, who had, through an access to information request, it was revealed that she noted that there was momentum that was growing in the defund the CBC movement across Canada. So I'm wondering if you have seen over the last number of years, and you'd mentioned you hear often from folks involved with your organization, has there been momentum growing in the defund the CBC
movement? Yeah, for sure. So I've been a journalist for most of my adult life. Largely in mainstream media, in and out of newsrooms, largely here in Ottawa. And I can tell you that there wasn't really a serious movement to defund the CBC 15 years ago, and maybe not even 10 years ago. Now you literally see it on T-shirts, on bumper stickers. People are pushing for the state broadcaster to be defunded for two reasons. Again, it's a huge waste of money. Just period. $1.4 billion is an astonishing amount of money. And two, journalists shouldn't be paid by the government. It doesn't matter if the journalist is right-wing or left-wing or a space alien. They shouldn't be paid by the government because it's a direct conflict of interest. So there is definitely a movement that's growing.
So it sounds like something else that Justin Trudeau has broken. But I am curious when it comes to the quite often we hear from folks that would support the CBC and in fact even those who would acknowledge some of the challenges that exist, whether it be the bonuses that were paid out or the expense or not liking the programming or acknowledging the bias that exists. But they say, well, we need it because that's how Canadians get their news. I'm wondering if you could comment on that feedback that quite often gets parroted, especially here in the nation's capital.
That's a great question, and it reminds me of the statement that we really appreciated coming from the Friends of Canadian Media when they said that those bonuses, $18 million worth of bonuses, were unbecoming of a public broadcaster. We agree. We agree. That is unbecoming. And so I think it's the bonuses that are really attracting a lot of the attention here. However, if so many people are watching the CBC and getting all their news from the CBC, why is 1.7% of the population of Toronto watching it? It's even lower in Calgary and Edmonton out west. So if the CBC costs us $1.4 billion per year and nobody is watching, is it still a waste of money? Yes, it is.
So for those that would say, well, it's required for Canadian culture, for the preservation of Canadian culture, how would you respond to that?
I find that odd because there's a lot of private media companies and there's a lot of other forms of entertainment and news that Canadians are choosing to watch and to listen to and to share. And the idea that a government-funded broadcaster is going to be the keeper of Canadian culture, is kind of insulting to people's intelligence and their own choice. If I don't watch the CBC, does that mean that I'm not Canadian? That's absurd. So no, Canadians are choosing to not watch the CBC. So ergo, we don't need it,
30
and
seconds.
we should defund it.
Thank you very much. I think I still had a bit over a minute.
1 minute, 30 seconds, yeah, sorry.
Okay. It was recently revealed that the government spent over $970,000 to produce a podcast that ended up only having 229 subscribers. That's a lot of dollars per subscriber. I'm wondering if, and this was specifically Stats Canada that had paid this close to $1 million. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or feedback about, nearly $1 million spent to produce a podcast that many people do from their phones, walking down the street, whatever the case is, for virtually no cost. Yet the government spent $1 million, yet only garnered a subscriber base of 229. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or feelings about that.
So off the top, quickly, I actually thought I misheard that when I first heard about it. I thought it was government funding other people's podcasts, whatever it was. But no, this was a government department's podcast. It is astonishing that they're spending a nickel on that. And I'm going to turn this over to my colleague. He's the investigative journalist for the CTF, Ryan Thorpe. Ryan, you were doing some digging on that. It was astonishing to see.
Yeah, so...
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Oh.
And you only have 15 seconds, thanks.
I'll just add quickly that we dug up these records. The costs are ridiculous. They're producing podcasts that no Canadian would ask or be willing to pay for. It's reflected in that subscriber count, and it is clearly a massive waste of our money.
Much.
I want to talk about the CBC as a concept, though. Back in 1936, when the Conservatives established the CBC, it was there to bring the country together, to connect the country. If you removed the dollar amount and you removed the bonuses, do you agree with the concept of CBC?
It's still a conflict of interest. And I say this more not from a taxpayer's perspective, even though we wouldn't want to spend money on a media company. We don't want to spend money on companies anyway. No corporate welfare. We don't care what they're producing. But as a journalist, a longtime journalist, it is just a fundamental conflict of interest for a journalist to be paid by the government. It doesn't matter if it's a conservative government or an NDP government or a left-leaning or right-leaning journalist. It is just fundamentally a conflict of interest for the media to be funded by the government.
Now,
Sorry.
I take that point. Now, CBC is more than just a television broadcaster. It's more than just a deliverer of news. It does a lot more than that. For example, children's programming, election coverage in our country, the Olympics, radio. This morning I woke up and I always open up my app, the CBC Listen app, and I listen to the morning news, but I also listen to the world news. That's how I, receive my news. I don't think I've turned on CBC, the channel, for a long time. It's usually direct through YouTube or directly through the website, through the GEM app. The statistics you gave, and I think Ms. Tate actually acknowledged this, that the viewership on television was dropping. But when you start to look at the actual online presence, like, for example, on election night, there were 9 million impression rates on the website. So we're seeing a huge jump in online listening through radio, through YouTube, through the GEM app. So I think it would be fair to say that there may not be growth on television, which is across all broadcasters. We've seen a decline. But would you acknowledge that when it comes to its online presence, the numbers are actually increasing drastically?
So there's a few things there. One, again, we're opposed to government-funded media, period. Two, when it comes to ratings, I found it really interesting that Ms. Tate and others at the CBC don't want to give us their subscriber numbers, not names or anything like that, that would be crazy, but their subscriber numbers to GEM. So it's one of those things where it's like, okay, nearly nobody's watching you on TV. Oh, trust us, we're picking it up with GEM. Okay, how many people have got on GEM? Sorry, I can't tell you that.
Right.
It's really odd. And so that's the main element, is that we don't want government funding media, and that the ratings, right, we don't actually have them for GEM or online.
But the other ratings are out there. Like, it's very clear. Like, if I just went into ChatGPT and put in what are the ratings for listenership, also for online viewing. the numbers come up they're very new. Like the fact that I said 9 million people tuned in online during Election Day says a lot. There's a lot of information there. Do you agree with, for example, the wage subsidy and also just the media support for example, Post Media has got tens of millions of dollars. So you disagree with any media? It doesn't matter if it's community-based, a small community newspaper.
Journalists shouldn't be paid by the government.
So
period.
You would even disagree that a small community broadcaster that is not-for-profit, that's servicing a community by maybe providing information into a remote community on an emergency, things like that, local news, you wouldn't support government supporting any of that at all?
The government should not pay media companies, period. And then if you start getting into things like, oh, well, what about Indigenous programming? The CBC spends a fraction of a percentage point on their Indigenous programming.
Right.
So they pay their executive bonuses more.
How do we deliver media, or I would say news? Because there's a difference sometimes between what a journalist may put on just general broadcasting for information, the weather, for example. How would you propose getting that? Canada's such a large country. How would you propose getting that information out there to all Canadians that maybe don't have access to the internet because of where they are, and they would have access to radio? How would you propose that people get that information?
Like an emergency basis?
Just on a regular basis, community information.
So
do you think government should be
30
supporting
seconds?
getting information out to little rural, small communities that normally wouldn't have enough capacity through a business approach to support a local media agency?
So again, we're talking about the behemoth that is the CBC,
No, I'm talking about
$1.4
just the
billion. And
concept.
just to be clear, you're whittling it down to this tiny little keyhole
Order,
of getting
please,
emergency information to people in the
order,
north?
You said you
Please.
just disagree with all
Order,
support
please.
to media.
Sorry, Chair.
To the next Conservative. 5 minutes, please, Mr. Giovanni.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Some questions for Ms. Sims and Mr. Thorpe. Do you think the CBC respects the Canadian taxpayer?
Well, with respect to the chair, I think that's a matter of opinion. A lot of people say they may not like the programming on the CBC, and perhaps that is why they're choosing to no longer watch it. But from the Canadian taxpayer's perspective, it's again those three main points. This cost of the CBC, the fact that nearly nobody is watching it anymore, and that journalists should not be paid by the government is what is really important here. As far as their opinions on their programming, whether news or fiction or entertainment, we would leave that up to Canadians.
If I could add to that quick. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation has an ongoing legal challenge against the CBC, so I filed an access to information request trying to seek how much of that bonus, the $18 million in bonuses that they hand out, went to their senior executives, the senior executive team. They're stonewalling the release of that information, claiming that it's personal information. Well, when it's taxpayers' money, taxpayers have every right to know how much the CBC is allocating to its senior executive bonuses. So we did launch that legal challenge, but I certainly don't think that shows much respect for Canadian taxpayers. The fact that we pay the bills, but they say we don't get to know how much they're spending on senior executive bonuses.
Yeah, so what I hear from Canadians in reaction to the current CEO, Ms. Catherine Tate, appearing before this committee, and also last week's appearance by the incoming CEO, Madame Bouchard, is a concern of that there's no real answers given in terms of any sort of accountability. Like at this committee, we can point to ad revenue dropping, viewership dropping, trust in the CBC dropping, and no sense of, okay, we've got to do something differently. Instead, what we get is them lining up and saying we just need hundreds of millions of more dollars. And I do think that has created an impression, in my view, accurately among a lot of Canadians, that there's just not a lot of respect for the taxpayer and the fact that there needs to be some value delivered in exchange for all of that money being given to the organization. What's your view on that?
I find it comes down to accountability, which is something that the Taxpayers Federation is always pushing for. And the fact that we saw the CEO, who again, I will point out, makes about $500,000 a year. The bonus she's entitled to is up to more than what the average Canadian family earns in an entire year in all of their paychecks. So the idea that they were not being accountable is deeply concerning to taxpayers. But we don't believe that this is fixable. We don't think that they should throw more money at the CBC. The very idea is astonishing because right now they're getting $1.4 billion. And again, to put that into perspective, that's the grocery bills of 85,000 families for an entire year. It is an outrageous amount of money. So the idea of throwing more money at them while they're being less and less accountable, we just don't think that's acceptable.
One quick point to add. So the CBC doesn't publish a sunshine list, but at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we file access to information requests, and we do that homework for them. Since 2015, the amount of CBC employees that are earning six figures and up has increased by 231%. So we're looking at the bonuses, which is $132 million in bonuses at the CBC since 2015. The six-figure salaries at the CBC have increased by 231%, and then we hear them come back time and time again, crying poor and asking for even more money. And I think from the perspective of a lot of Canadian taxpayers, it's enough is enough.
I think it's about 1,000 people they've added to the Sunshine List.
An extra 1,000 people on their sunshine list.
Yes.
Well, we've heard today also from this organization, Friends of Canadian Media, another ask for more money, and that more money is going to solve all of the problems. They've also said, though, that they're unhappy with pretty much every prime minister in my lifetime has not given them enough money. It sounds to me like this is a hustle. It's an insatiable appetite. There's always going to be an ask for more. There's never going to be enough money. The more they fail, the more they need money. It's a circle that never stops. Do you think that's a fair interpretation?
So, to be nice off the top, we do really appreciate what the Friends of the Public Broadcaster or Canadian Media said when they said this decision for bonuses is deeply out of touch and unbefitting of our national public broadcaster.
30 seconds.
We agree with that. But again, the idea of just putting more money into government-funded media is just the opposite of what taxpayers want. We want media to be privately funded through willing donations or subscriptions or a give, send, go. However you give money to the media of your choice is how this should play out. The notion of just giving more taxpayers' money into government-funded media, that is just not going to work.
For journalism to work, it must stand on its own 2 feet. It's the only way it works.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you might share with me your views on foreign interference or foreign ownership of Canadian media. Do you think that's a reasonable way out of this to let foreign buyers buy Canadian news outlets and media outlets?
That's kind of getting a little bit away from what we're here to point out about the funding of the CBC.
No, but I'm asking you to ask the question.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
I think I consider that question to be in order. Thank you.
Madam Chair, I'm concerned that I'm giving my opinion about who should fund government who should fund media outside of government. We believe that Canadians should pay for the media that they want to watch.
Okay.
By and large, and that private companies should raise money through ads, through subscriptions, through donations. Like, for example, here we have Blacklock's Reporter, which has a subscription by year, and they do outstanding journalism, and it's two hardworking Canadian journalists. And so whether or not you get money from outside, I don't know. I guess it would be up to the private company.
Yeah, I think there's a conversation to be had about this. You have said, and I hear you loud and clear, that there should be no government subsidies, period, and there should certainly be no funding of subsidies to the media in Canada. Are you concerned about the level of subsidy that Post Media gets from the federal government that they have now built into their business plan, and to the fact that they are taking Canadian taxpayer dollars and also paying their bonuses to executives that are probably 100, in some cases 10 or 15 or 20 times larger than what CBC pays its executives?
So to be clear, there's two separate streams here that we're talking about. There's the CBC, which is $1.4 billion, and then I think what you're talking about there is often referred to as the media bailout, if you can call it that, roughly $500 million. Is that what you're talking about?
No, there's a series of different. If you read Post Media's annual report, they disclose that government subsidy, a variety of different kinds, is actually part of their now business plan.
Yes.
Does that concern you?
Yes, very much so. It concerns us. To be clear, it works out sometimes, depending on the media outlet, roughly $30,000 per employee of media company outside of the CBC. That is highly alarming. One, taxpayers shouldn't be paying for that. And two, journalists should not be paid by the government.
Did you mentioned that you've done some work with True North, right?
I've been a journalist for most of my adult life. I do hits and media interviews with all outlets.
Are you concerned that True North took government subsidy? Have you expressed that same concern about True North?
No media company should take government
Including
subsidy,
True North?
period.
Okay.
Any of them.
Do you believe, so you've said you need to defund the CBC, and I want to be very clear. When you talk about the CBC, you're talking about CBC, Radio-Canada, the entire thing, correct?
Yes, $1.4 billion.
The entire thing.
Should not be going to that company.
So every French language broadcast, everything in Quebec, every dollar, I just want to be absolutely clear, every dollar of federal money that goes to the CBC and Radio-Canada should be taken away.
I will point out that the CBC, to its credit, does raise some of its own money.
Right.
So I think it's around, I'd have to go back and check, it's around $400 million around there, maybe even $500 million. That's nothing to sneeze at. That's an awful lot of money that they're generating on their own.
Right, but
And
you would say
perhaps they could
all
produce their own
federal
programming.
money, all federal subsidy for CBC and Radio-Canada should disappear.
No taxpayers' money should
No
go to
taxpayer
that
money.
company.
Okay, so taxpayer money would be government subsidy, correct?
Sure, whatever
Okay.
you want to call it. It comes
Okay.
from the taxpayer. It doesn't come from the government, but it's issued by the government.
So if we dig into this a little bit more deeply, where there are markets which are called news deserts, and there is no ability for news to get to those places, and we have coverage concerns in this country, how do you respond to the fact that there are populations in this country, if the CBC were to disappear, or to be defunded to the point where they focused entirely on those things that were entirely profitable, which is largely going to be urban and those types of things. What would you do for those communities? How would you ensure that the communities in rural Canada, Indigenous communities, Francophone communities in places like Vancouver got access to news coverage and to media coverage that would inform them?
Okay. With respect to the chair, you mentioned Indigenous programming, and I wanted to share this with you. So according to the CBC's 2022-2023 annual report, it spent $6.4 million on its Indigenous services.
Mm-hmm.
That is about 0.5% of its budget.
My question is, how would you get coverage to those communities? My question isn't just about whether or not the CBC did this. My question is, if the CBC money were all to disappear, where would you go and how would you get news into these communities, particularly Francophone communities in language minority places like British Columbia, Indigenous communities that are doing this programming? It's not a question of the dollars for me. The dollars are important, but my question to you is, how would you actually deliver that programming? That's what I'm concerned about.
Well, that's perhaps something that Canadian Heritage could figure out, maybe even around this council table, this committee table.
Thank you. I think we have ended your 5-minute round, Mr. Noor Mohammed. Thank you very much. Finish your sentence and let's...
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. I just did want to point out that the spending with Indigenous programming, the CBC spent more than double on its bonuses alone than it did on its Indigenous programming. So it has a lot of work to do there.
Michael, Anna, and Julie. That's not what he has. Thank you very much. I think we have to end this session.